Good afternoon, Paul. Good afternoon, Karen. I'd like to thank you folks for allowing us to get together so that the voters can understand the differences between the two candidates. My name is Hugh McKenney. I live in Salem. I've got 3 kids. They've went to Salem School and graduated East Lyme High School. Great communities. We absolutely love the communities. I guess you could look at this intro as, why am I running? I'm running to make a positive difference in the community. The community has been very good to my family over the years, especially over the last few. I've had a number of challenges, and the community was fantastic. I owe it to give back to the community, and that's why I want to represent them in the legislature. The state's at a very critical turning point right now. We've got this fiscal long-term problem that's been hanging over our head for years, and enough's enough. I've been watching the state legislature kick the can down the road for years. And the other turning point is how we deal with it and how we treat the citizens of Connecticut. I want to be part of that discussion and represent the majority of people in the district, not just a small sliver. People who are on the far right, as opposed to, I'm in the middle. I want to work and get as much information from people and collaborate with as many people as possible and bring civility back to the process.
You talked about a critical turning point. I imagine you're talking about what we do about the lack of fiscal stability in the state. You're saying the kicking the can down the road. We've seen successive budget crisis sort of year after year. The legislature seems to be yet again dealing with a deficit, trying to figure out how to close the holes. Could you talk about this turning point, what you see as the turning point, and how you would go about it, trying to work with the rest of the legislature to address it?
We are at a turning point right now because we have this huge mounting deficits that are coming up planned for the next few years because of the state pension and teacher pension funds not being thoroughly funded over the last many years. And then under the Rell administration and the Rowland administration, we continued to push back those payments, pushing them down the road. Today, 21 cents out of every dollar collected in revenues goes to the state to pay for the pensions. In 5 to 6 years, that number, if nothing changes, would go to 41%. We have got to work to get the funding for the pensions more than what's currently being allocated. We've got to work to get those balloon payments down. I would very much like to see the funding for, let's say, the state lottery be diverted into the funding for the funds so that are unfunded right now. Those pensions for the state workers and the teachers' retirements are just weighting down the state and have to be resolved. And I would work with the legislators in a collaborative effort, working together to do things like cutting the state budget. The Commission on Fiscal Stability, on Fiscal Stability and Economic Growth had a number of recommendations that were tied to that. Now, some of those are great recommendations, other of them are maybe very difficult to pass. But we need to look at them in their entirety and act upon them.
Kind of the big takeaway from the commission was they felt we needed major fiscal reforms. Sort of the broad outlines were reduce the income tax, find the revenues elsewhere. They suggested increasing the sales tax, implementation of the payroll tax, and they said you got to find like $1 billion in savings and in waste and efficiency savings in the legislature. Sort of out of that out of those option choices, any particular, you think are good choices, or what alternatives might you offer as a legislator to try to address the shortfall you talked about?
Well, I think we do need to look at both sides of the equation. The revenue streams need to be enhanced, and I am in support of legalizing sports betting. It's been vetted now. It's time to move forward. We can be bringing in some significant revenues to the state by legalizing this. I'm also in support of tolling the highways. Now, I don't want to go around taxing everyone, but I do believe that tolling the highways at the entrances to the major state roads, 95, 91, 395, and 84, only for the trucks, the big 18 tractor trailer trucks, 18-wheelers, coming in and leaving the state. I do not believe that's going to put a significant burden on businesses. We're the only state on the eastern seaboard that doesn't toll its highways now that Rhode Island has started doing it. It's been estimated that between $200 and $250 million would be able to come into the state, and we could earmark that for improving our infrastructure. Our roads and our bridges are in terrible shape. Here in East Lyme, where Route 161 has a bridge over it for 95. That's been designated as one of the bridges that is in most need for some type of maintenance and repair going forward on it. We have not been able to fund that because the gas tax is continuously fluctuating and going down. Now, this is a good thing in terms of using less gas because we're putting less CO2 and carbon monoxide and poisons into the air. However, going forward, we need a stable fund revenue stream to pay for our infrastructure improvements. And tolling the trucks is a good way to do it. Now, as I walk the roads and knock on doors, many, many people in our district agree that's absolutely what we should be doing, is tolling the trucks, because they really don't pay much at all in terms of maintaining our roads. They come in and they go through and that's it. And they, in the process, chew up the roads. I'm also in favor of legalizing marijuana and using that revenue. Now, that being said, it's very important to make sure we have that as a controlled process. We have to make sure that we do not let marijuana get into the hands of children. It's very clear on multiple studies, my sisters being two nurses and have become nurse practitioners, have brought to my attention during these discussions that absolutely marijuana is so dangerous and detrimental to developing brains, just like alcohol is. We worked a long time, a century ago, to try to keep alcohol out of people's hands. It didn't work. Marijuana is not my cup of tea, but I don't think there's any problem with adults using it for recreation in the privacy of their own home. So that's how I'd be looking at bringing in some additional revenues into the state. And I believe those mechanisms would have the least amount of impact on the middle class. Getting back, Paul, to your comment about the fiscal study, one of the things they were talking about was very much a rebalancing of the taxes. I would agree that we could be looking at some tax loopholes to shut down. That's absolutely one of the first things we should be doing. I don't want to raise taxes on anyone in terms of the income tax. Sales tax, about increasing the sales tax, I'm very leery about doing that. But I do believe in giving the authority to the municipalities through the COGS, the Council of Governments, and let those municipalities and regions determine if they want to make a very small increase into the sales tax for their region only. This would help many municipalities ease the burden on property taxes. That's one of the major issues that people, when I knock doors, tell me about. The property taxes are killing me everywhere you go. That's how we need to try to work to reduce some of those problems.
Would you explain that a little bit more? A regional tax rather than a...
The Commission on Economic Stability and Sustainability looked at one of their recommendations for the state legislator to authorize using possibly the COG methods. This was just a trial balloon type thing, and a straw dog to say, hey, let's use those regional governments to look at whether there may be some municipalities that want to do that, and it would be no more than a 0.5% increase that they would be limited to. So, as folks may not know, the state has always held the authority to tax people, and they've given the authority to the municipalities to implement a property tax. But that's about it. Municipalities don't have the ability to seek outside revenues. And the lack of a constant revenue stream, with the exception of property taxes, has been absolute murder on communities, because they are so reliant upon that to fund their schools and to fund their local government. And depending on where the state is in a given time, the state has had a tendency to pull back on its commitments to fund schooling and to fund a number of unfunded mandates, that it falls back upon the towns, and it goes directly to the townspeople that have to pay higher property taxes. And make no mistake about it, if for some reason the new governor were to be able to abolish the state income tax, I have absolutely no idea that I have absolutely no belief that I know that my property taxes would double or triple, and so would yours.
Would you tie the ability to impose some minimal regional sales tax on to regional initiatives, that there might be a quid pro quo that the towns and cities have to commit to programs like road, collectively on road maintenance, on purchasing, maybe regional efforts that might be more efficient? Would that, which I think is what the commission, that would be sort of a carrot.
Right. That could be an enhancement that would absolutely allow folks to look at utilizing this process. I would have no problem at all having that included in the legislature, to understand and to get a collaborative effort between the state and the municipalities, as opposed to the constant tug of war that we see between the state and the municipalities.
Mm-hmm.
That needs to be a thing of the past, and we need to work collaboratively, not just as party to party, but town to state and town to town, looking at regionalization. Now, generally speaking, in regionalization, I am a supporter of that. Absolutely. We've done it for the probate judges a number of years ago, and that's been successful. In our community, in the 37th district, we have an agreement between the towns of Salem and East Lyme, where Salem sends its children to the high school for East Lyme. And that's been a very, very positive commitment for both towns. We've both grown from that, and we've both been successful with that. That being said, this is New England, and home rule is embodied and embedded to people in their souls. And they look at it, many folks look at it and say, don't take away my right to elect my local town government, or take decisions away from me. So in order for regionalization to work, we need to move forward with an educational process. We need to educate the municipal leaders, the municipality government officials, and then the citizens, so that people understand that there are positive benefits that can come out of regionalization. And until we get that buy-in, large-scale regionalization will be difficult, if not impossible, to implement. And if it's not successful, we'll end up wasting money in the long term. So that's what I think we need to do in the first place, is education of people on how regionalization can work for us. And then move forward into these collaborative discussions with all the stakeholders to get buy-in.
You know, so in my regular day job, I cover the courts, and so I work around a lot of state employees. Would you speak about the size of our state government? Does it need to be resized? And what do we do about pensions moving forward in terms of our state workers?
Well, let me say this about pensions. Pensions absolutely need to be maintained for the people who've been promised them. There are folks in Hartford who are talking about cutting pensions that are already active. That's wrong. It's as simple as that. Now, as you know, we have a multi-tier process in the pension program. We're up to Tier 4. And Tier 4 is somewhat of a hybrid process. We need to look at that carefully, and we may need to develop a Tier 5 process. Pension reform has got to be critical to help the state pull out of its financial crisis and get some stability in terms of financial planning. I don't have all the answers on how it would work out, but I do know we need to be looking at those and making some changes in the future. Now, government in the state has downsized tremendously over the years. Are there more efficiencies that can be gained by them? Perhaps. I am absolutely in favor of looking at where we can gain efficiencies if we can downsize. On the same accord, I don't think necessarily that downsizing and then subbing everything out to the private sector is necessarily the right thing to do. I would not necessarily be an advocate for that unless there was a huge balance, or imbalance, I should say, as to why there would be a strong benefit for that.
Two major planks, at least in the Democratic Party, at least with the gubernatorial candidate, Mr. Lamont, he's talked that he would push for gradually bringing in a $15 minimum wage, and he supported mandatory family leave legislation, so people continue to get an income when some family emergency requires leave. Do you support those initiatives? Why not?
I absolutely support these initiatives. No one working 40 hours a week should have to live in poverty. That's just wrong. A livable wage of $15 an hour is something that we absolutely have to strive for. Now, I know business may turn around and say, well, this is too much of a burden on us, especially small businesses. And I don't want to choke off small business, because small business is the economic engine that drives the state and the country. That being said, I think there is possibilities where we could look at a minimum wage for people who are younger, who aren't supporting families, maybe going through school, and who work for small companies. That possibly could be lower in certain circumstances, but it's something that I wouldn't say is the first priority. We need to get a workable minimum wage for people who work 40 hours a week, which brings up the other issue. There are so many companies, large out-of-state companies, manufacturers and retailers, who refuse to have people working more than 40 hours a week. We'll keep them at part-time, so we give them no benefits. And because it's just cheaper for them to keep 70 people at 30 hours as opposed to 50 people at full-time. We've got to stop that. We've got to come up with a way to resolve that, because that's simply wrong. That needs to be fixed, and I'll work hard to do that. Now, my opponent doesn't look at it that way. My opponent, Hawley, will look at it and say, Oh no, it's just too expensive to try to, we don't have the money to do it. We don't have the money to do it. Well, they said that when the minimum wage was $6 an hour. And then when we bumped it higher, we survived that. And then when the minimum wage got to $8 an hour, we bumped it up. We survived that too. It can be done. And that's one of the differences, one of the many differences between Holly and I.
She also, on the family leave, she also expressed concern that would be an anti-business piece of legislation that would impose an additional cost on business, and she said on the state, because at least the legislation that was proposed in the last session would have the state on the hook if a small business is unable to meet its obligations. Could you address, you said you would support family leave?
Absolutely.
Well,
And here's the difference here, is that I would be in support of legislation that looks at using a partnership between the private and the public sector. I can tell you that there are times in people's lives where you absolutely have to be there for your family. If you have a spouse who's sick, children who are critically ill, and now, as many of us baby boomers are aging out, we have to take care of our parents when they're undergoing significant crises. It's important as a society that we take care of the people that need to be taken care of. And this is one way to do it, to make sure that people like you and I and Karen can take care of our parents when they're in long-term health care situations. It's the right thing to do. And the argument that says, oh, we just can't fund it, or it'll be too much of a burden, it won't be too much of a burden if we make it a collaborative effort between the employer, the employee, and the state to have a super fund put together to aid in helping people in this situation. That would significantly lessen the impact on the big business and small businesses by having this collaborative effort where the employee may pay in a little bit deducted from their paycheck, and the state may pay in a little bit deducted from the paycheck. And we'd have controls put in place to make sure that, yes, it's a viable, correct application of family medical leave, and it's justified. Therein lies the difference between Holly and myself. We have to have compassion for our brothers and sisters, and if we can't have it with our moms and dads and children that we have to take care of, something's wrong here.
Connecticut, since the Great Recession, Connecticut's lagged behind most of its neighbors in job recovery.
Yes.
That's coincided with the Democrats being in control the last 8 years of all branches, the governorship, the legislature. So, kind of two-part question. One, what can the state do, or should it be doing to try to generate job recovery? And two, what about give Republicans a chance? Democrats had a shot at it, and we haven't seen the growth we'd like. So, why not give Republicans a shot?
Well, that's really a two-phased answer.
Yeah.
I am absolutely want to work with the Republicans to come up with the right answer. We need to bring back civility and compromise into our government. Now, much of what's being put forward on the Republican side of the House is trying to implement programs and tools that have been used in places like Kentucky and Louisiana. Those have failed miserably. Trickle-down economics didn't work in the 80s, and it's not going to work today. Drastic cuts in social programs may make some people feel better in the long term. And cutting teachers' salaries may make people feel better in the long term. But it will not be an economic engine to drive us forward into the future. However, I do want to work in the middle. Holly doesn't want to work in the middle. Holly is on the far right of the political spectrum. She's voted Republican 95% of the time, and when she hasn't voted Republican, it's because the Republicans crossed over in bipartisan votes, and Holly was left remaining saying, no, I'm not going to vote for it, even though the majority of Republicans do vote for it. How can we bring back jobs? We need to be focusing on some of the recommendations in the fiscal commission report that talks about improving STEM. What I believe we need to do is to gear our colleges, the UConn system, into focusing on strong education for STEM, along with educators. In order to keep younger people here in the state, what I'd like to see is possibly implementing some kind of tuition reduction or tuition credit for people such as educators who would be willing to commit to working X amount of years in the state. It's a trade-off. Once the person works a few years in the state, they're able to get their, clearly that will minimize college debt, hopefully not eliminate it. And then those folks will be free and clear, or with little debt, where they will absolutely want to stay in the state. Because Connecticut's a great place to live. I love Connecticut. I am so tired of people putting down Connecticut. It's a great place to live. I've lived in Vermont and Massachusetts. They're beautiful states. But Connecticut is great.
We briefly touched on the tolls, but there are some serious highway issues in the region. Could you talk a little bit about how we might get some help for the bridge repairs and the bad stretch of highway right there in East Lyme that is the source of many accidents?
As I walk knocking doors in the district, talking to people, I keep a list of everything that folks tell me. Number one is always taxes too high, followed closely by number two, the traffic is killing us. So I believe we need to be looking at, for at least for our region, is that bottleneck in 95 that drives through East Lyme and Waterford and just south of East Lyme. As we're in the Limes coming up, we need to look at possibly extending that highway to a third lane. I believe there's enough land to work at doing that, and it would be a very big project. But that's just one, that's the easy answer when people say, what else can we do? Well, we also need to look at more high-speed rail. We need to look at improving the rail services between our region, New London being a great place to grab the train, and head down to New Haven. We absolutely have to be looking at improving that infrastructure to get more people in rail service. And interestingly enough, many young people I talk to are demanding rail and bus. They don't want to drive cars. My daughter hates driving her car. She wants to get better service for public transportation in the region. And she's not alone. Many friends of hers who come over and visit and we talk about it, they're in the same scenario. They want to live in a vibrant city, in a vibrant region, and not have to deal with the hassles of owning a car. So the answer to your question is really a multi-phase approach that needs to happen. And looking at how we fund that, we talked about the tolls, but I'm a big supporter of the lockbox initiative, which will be a constitutional amendment that's being presented this November 6th, where you, the voter, will have a choice to determine, do you want to make sure that when we say the legislature is going to be allocating funds for infrastructure, those funds go into a lockbox and cannot be redistributed into the general fund of the state, that those funds have to go only to improving the infrastructure of the region. And I support that 100%.
On education, the Supreme Court, state Supreme Court, threw out Judge Mukaush's order, which called for some pretty dramatic changes in how Connecticut funds education. And some of the urban centers like New London and New Haven are concerned with that pressure valve now relieved on more affluent communities, and I think you could argue East Lyme and Salem kind of come under that title, that the pressure's kind of off, and there won't be a willingness to provide the state aid they may feel is necessary to kind of close that education gap between those urban centers and their more affluent neighbors. So as a representative a place like East Lyme and Salem, which are regarded for their good schools, how much willingness should a representative such as yourself have to help fund recovery in these other communities that aren't maybe as fortunate with their schools?
What you've given me is a sucker's choice. Kind of like, when did you stop beating your wife? However, Paul, what I will say is that as a representative of East Lyme and Salem, I would fight to maintain funding to our district. Now, that being said, we need to look very carefully at what the formula looks like, and this is where I think the state may need to step up and provide additional funding. In fact, we have to provide additional funding to meet the court order, to meet the constitutional requirement for a fair education. Now, that doesn't mean lowering the standards in one and defunding one to bring up the standards in another and to fund the other. It doesn't have to be an or situation. There are always options out there, and there is another option to go at looking at, saying this is where the state may need to provide additional funding, quite frankly. Do it in a collaborative manner. Because, as you know, every member of the House and every member of the Senate is always going to be fighting to make sure his district gets the entitled piece of the pie. The towns have been running their budgets on those numbers for years now. Cutback of those is not the right thing to do, because all you're doing is pressing it back down into the property taxes, and we already talked about property taxes being too high. The state is a $20 billion a year operating company, if you look at it from that fashion. Now, I'll be honest with you, I don't have all the answers, but we ought to be able to find the money some way through these enhanced revenue streams that I talked about to provide this additional funding for the school systems of the state. And again, that's where I'm so different than my opponent. She's a one-dimensional thinker. I don't look at it that way. I look at it as, what's the big picture look like? How can we bring people together to work together and find the right solution from both sides of the aisle? Not just, we don't have enough money, we can't pay for it, end of discussion. That's not the world. Karen, I'm an engineer. I just recently retired.
Not to, I hate to interrupt, but we want to give everyone a half hour, and we're kind of getting over that. But
I don't want to do that then.
But no, go ahead. I mean, just give you a minute to wrap up or something we haven't covered, which we gave Holly the same instance. But before you start, I just wanted to say we kind of have to.
Okay, I appreciate that.
Yeah.
So we'll go through a wrap up right now, right?
Yeah,
okay.
Yeah. Thank you.
Well, Karen and Paul, I do want to thank you for giving me the opportunity to be able to differentiate between Holly and I. You, the voter, have a distinct choice to make this November 6th. You can choose someone who has a career track record of working together with people, having an independent mind, finding the solution and implementing the solution, working together collaboratively with many people. Holly is not that person. She's a far-right Republican who is out of touch with her district. She voted against the codification in the state for the American Care Act that came out that the state legislature had to put in place to make sure that we were protected if the federal government starts to pull back on their commitments. Holly voted against the bump stock ban. It was an overwhelming bipartisan vote that many Republicans decided, yes, this is the right thing to do. We as a community don't believe we need a tool that can turn a semi-automatic rifle into an automatic rifle and basically cut someone in half by its automatic rapid firing. Those are the differences. Again, I believe in working together and doing it collaboratively and civilly. I am so tired, and I hear people in the street saying the exact same thing. They are tired of people fighting and tired of people ignoring each other at state level. We need to work together to solve our problems, because I believe we need to give the state back to our kids in a little better place than when we inherited it years ago. We're not meeting that so far. So I ask for your support and I ask for your vote.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you.